One of the things that Wendy and I really noticed when we were pulling together the outcomes and all the things that we've been working on for the past couple of years is how the timing, like timing is everything. And we were fortunate to be hitting this topic at a time when it is, we're just really positioned as an industry and as a society to look at it. So just a little background of what was going on around us while this was happening. There was research in Canada as well as in some of our other global trading partners about the impact that certain events were having on farmers, and we're alerting people at a higher level about the situation with farmers. We also had just came out of the COVID pandemic, and of course that showed us very quickly that we weren't in our mental health space, we weren't really equipped to deal with the level of problems that people were facing in rural and in the urban environments. The COVID pandemic, we had the healthcare system crisis that came out of that. We saw a centralization of services just as desperate measures to try and get us into as a position where we could still deliver healthcare in the province. And as rural people, we felt that as a leaving of our communities and leaving us out there to dry. So that was that centralization of services was really happening at that time. And we had resolutions from industry and from municipal governments asking for farm-specific mental health resources and services that were coming in. We also had a new federal, provincial, territorial agreement, which had included now mental health as a topic that we can address through those dollars. The charitable giving was something that I discovered too, that it was something that was disrupted. They changed some of the rules. And what we had in Alberta, it's changed now a little bit now that we have a Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. But prior to that, mental health was like the little piece of our healthcare budget. It was around 7%, and most of that went for addictions and more of the acute care on the mental health space. And so a majority of our mental health support system was supported by that philanthropy and not-for-profits and volunteerism. And so when they disrupted the flow of charitable funds, when they changed some of the rules, that really put everybody in a state of, oh my gosh, how do we continue to deliver on our outcomes without these monies that we're normally used to getting? And so people in that space of those charitable organizations and our mental health system were actually open and looking for efficiencies, or looking how can we work together. So as the new kid on the block, looking just for farmers, there was a real openness to discuss and see how we fit in the system. And I think that was something that nobody anticipated, and it was just the stars lining up to allow us to have that. So we were actually able to accomplish quite a lot in such a short amount of time because everybody was sort of primed and ready for that. We also had two pieces of policy that hadn't been updated for quite a while. Our rural development strategy kind of got left and hadn't been updated. And so also our rural health strategy was kind of in that place where they needed an update. And both of those have now been published. And AgNow, we have been building AgNow along the same lines and trying to deliver on those policies. So it's just some really unfortunate but fortuitous situations that have allowed us to do as much as we have in such a short amount of time. So if you can recall, we did a white paper. So we had done a needs assessment, came up with a white paper, presented that to the minister, and that's what got this whole thing really started. From that white paper, there was a few things that were going on that we discovered. One was that there was really low engagement from the agriculture community with our mainstream publicly funded healthcare system around mental health supports and services. We noticed that the healthcare people and the service providers that we engaged with were like, yeah, we can see where farmers, the ones that were rural, were saying we can see where farmers could maybe use some targeted initiatives, but nobody was working on that. The ones that are in a more urban environment are like, why would we target farmers? It doesn't make any sense. So there was a few gaps in between the research and then the actual healthcare system. So we had a few recommendations. If you remember, one is about getting the farm mental health network, and that's about making it a central point of connection for the farmers and for the people that are trying to work with the farmers. And so we want to be that connection, getting people into the system and finding the resources they need faster. There's research that shows you get referred up to 5 times before you find the service and mental health that you need in Canada. So how can we shorten that up? There's about building capacity within our healthcare system. So those guys that were like, why would we target farmers? We want them to understand that so that they are designing programs and services that actually will benefit farmers and will be used by farmers. The enhancing the farm culture, knowledge about healthcare workers, and supporting community-based programs. Now, this community-based programs is really about that economic development piece. Remembering that it's our ag societies and our 4-H and our farmers markets and those events that we do rural are those places. That's where we support mental health and that peer-to-peer networks that support the mental health and help us to get through those changes in the economy and all the things that we have to deal with as farmers. And so we wanted to make sure those things were recognized by a government so that when it came to budgets, they're not like, why are we funding rodeos in Southern Alberta? Like, why are we doing that, right? So they had to understand the context and how important it is to actually supporting the health and well-being of the people in the rural areas. So those were our recommendations. So from that work, we found themes that came out of our needs assessment. Several of the themes that we came up with, we kind of summarized them in this way, like you're seeing on the screen. But when we talked about mental health and well-being of farmers, the first thing that people talk about is the conflicts between multi-generation and trying to turn over the farms in that long legacy piece of farm transition. Then it was the resiliency barriers. That was one that we kind of encapsulated everything all the little bits and pieces. So I'm going to talk about these in a different order than I on the slide. I'm sorry, Wendy, but I can't get my head around it. Okay, so the farm transition and succession, and I think anybody that's been involved with that, you see that it kind of ends at that farm family dynamics or communication within families, and that's where it ends. So there's lots of supports that are going into the business and encouraging making those plans, but there's not a whole lot taking the approach of how do we position families in a good space to do those farm transitions. And we know that it's those multi-generational farms that have that longer view, that bring that long view and commitment to community to those rural communities. And so they are a huge part of that piece of having that longer view that are willing to like invest in the next generation. And you need those in our rural communities because it is difficult to have that long view when our programs come in such, by every 3-month or 3-year cycles. The depopulation in livestock was another one. We were going through avian influenza while we were doing this development, but we also had chronic wasting disease. When I started digging in, there's a lot of animals in Alberta or farms in Alberta that have been impacted by disease depopulations, not just on the avian influenza, but there was quite a number of farmers. We found when I went through and scanned through CFIA and their directory that the majority of the depopulation events in Canada are happening in Western Canada, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, because we have the most of the livestock, so it just makes sense. And we're not really well equipped to actually support people through this process. And we see that even in our vet community, it's really difficult. And what we hear from the vets, large animal livestock vets in rural areas have a high turnover. We lose them very quickly to pets in the city because they can make more money, and it's not as hard on their hearts as it can be when it's in depopulation. So how can we support people through that process that is often a necessary process? And how can we build the capacity to do that? So it was livestock depopulation, the succession planning, and then the family farm resiliency barriers. It kind of encapsulates all of the other things, and there was a lot. So people coming forward where their children had mental health diagnoses and want to live in a rural community instead of having to move to a group home in a city where they're not comfortable and they're not supported by their family. Stuff like that kind of fell into that farm family resiliency barriers. A lot of the peer-to-peer supports that, like, honestly, we're not going to have clinical people walking around and noticing that somebody needs some kind of a friend or a referral to a service, that's going to be us as neighbors and people in the community that are doing that. So how can we build that capacity? Those are some of those things. Now, suicide was one that we didn't expect. There are 2 centers of suicide prevention in the province and some really awesome tools that they've created for Alberta. So we had no intention to get into that space. However, once we started doing those in community events and getting feedback from the communities, we found that suicide was that like just an undercurrent in every conversation that had to do about mental health. And a lot of the people that would come up and share their stories were about how they had been impacted by suicide. So there's clearly a disconnect between what the initiatives are doing and getting it to the community. And so we're trying to play in that space of how do we get better adoption of the tools that have already been created, and how can we support the community to address suicide so that we can reverse this trend that we're seeing right now. So that's the themes.
And you know, this next slide's really interesting, Linda. I'd love you to kind of share with everyone. You heard loud and clear throughout all forms of research where farmers prefer to get their advice from. So I'd love you to share that with everyone.
Yeah, and like this isn't something that's new to anybody that's actually entrenched in the industry. Anybody that's worked in ag research extension or has tried to help farmers adopt innovations knows that we really like to get our information from people who understand the industry. There's just something special about agriculture, and I know when I say that in a mixed crowd, I get, oh, I don't know why it's so special. You guys all think you're special, but clearly it is because we have a wetland policy that is like this for industry and except for agriculture, right? And we have tax accountants that are only for agriculture. There's a lot of pieces of legislation and regulation where there's this except for agriculture. So there is clearly something unique about this industry, and I think it has a lot to do with it, the public good that we use a public commodity is what we're producing. Like people feel attachment to food and environment and animals, and that's just the way it is. Like it's not my soil on my farm, although I feel it's my soil. Society thinks it's their soil. Oh, so there's something different about farming. And so having professionals that actually understand not only the farming bits, but also how farming in the community of rural and what that means and how to incorporate that into decision making, because it is part of the decision making on what we do and what we don't do. So agriculture professionals are really important. Other farmers, peer to peer, we have 50 million acres, right? So what we're trying to adopt in southern Alberta, we need to talk to other farmers who have adopted it in order to adopt it in the piece, right? So that's peer to peer learning is really important. And then to be able to go and find resources and do my own research on my time so that I'm outside when it's daylight, and at night is that's when I want to do this. Well, our healthcare system does not work on daylight hours the same way that farmers do. So making sure that we have resources and services that they can access on their time schedule is really important. And those are some of the barriers that we saw and some of the values that we saw. And they were backed up by the research studies that were doing it. So it's not just what we all know. Apparently other people outside the industry have seen this as well.
Nice. And here's a quote that we wanted to share with you, and we thought it'd be nice to drop it in at this very point, just, resonating really what Linda's just said there. And this is a direct quote from someone within the Agno network that is highly engaged with work that Agno's been doing. And I'll just read it to you. So, helpful support has been a mental health professional who has been on site in a supportive capacity, not specifically for mental health, but there to address the challenges that are being faced at the time, whether that's shoveling hay or filling sandbags or whatever it is, but being available to help and then listen while they're there. So, Linda, you have an example, and you had an example specifically to BC's AgSafe floods.
Yeah, so that when the floods were happening in BC, and there's a lot of animals that were being trapped in barns and that sort of thing, the Red Cross, as part of their crisis response, funded BC AgSafe to hire 2 social workers, and they come from outside of the agriculture industry. But being there at the disaster relief places. They were helping to fill sandbags and just got right into the work that was being done there. And because they did that, it overcame some of those what people from research call stigma that happens in agriculture. It put them at the same level, and people really opened up to them, and they were actually able to offer support to quite a few families through that disaster because they were willing to get in the trenches. And that's what we find over and over again when it's in rural and small. It's about having trust and that you're going to be there and that you understand, and being able and willing to get into the trenches is how we do that. So yeah, it was something I think
Nice.
that really, yeah, was poignant.
And I know the goal today is to really talk about that made in Alberta approach. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so like that was our goal right from the beginning is with the resolutions and everything that was going on. There was a lot of like, well, what does this look like for Alberta? We know that Alberta is different than other provinces, and a lot of the mental health approaches have been piloted and created in Eastern Canada and Ontario and Quebec, and even Prince Edward Island has a pretty cool counseling program that's been going for like 20 years. And so, like, what do we need in Alberta? We know that Alberta is kind of unique with the amount of land that we have and how sparsely populated it is. So that presents some really big delivery challenges. We have a really diverse um, farming community, which is not the same as in some of those other bigger places. And then, most importantly, in Ontario and Quebec, all farmers have to be a member of an ag association, and they pay membership fees. And then those membership fees can be leveraged as the 40% against the federal, provincial, territorial agreement. So in this case, sustainable cap, as the matching dollars. So they can actually mobilize pretty fast when there's opportunities that present themselves. But we don't have that in Alberta, and I'm not advocating for that in Alberta, that we all have to be members of a particular association and pay fees. So we have to think outside the box and come up with ways that we can get that 40% investment that's coming from industry so that we can kind of be in a stable position and actually leverage it with government dollars to focus resources and services that match and align on farm and address our needs. So this project has been, up until now, a lot of just storming, trying to figure out where we fit, how we can leverage, how we can enhance what's already going on, because there's a lot of really good work already happening in this province. How do we fit, and how do we enhance in a way that really helps farmers with what they want? And so we've been very, very, very strict about staying focused on what is needed at the farm gate and what the farmers are telling us. And so we really appreciate our stakeholders that have been involved, and it's been quite a, well, hardest and most rewarding contract I've ever worked on. So.
And as I add to that, let's talk about some other realities within our sector. And some of these realities are being faced, by others in other sectors as well. But what's absolutely key is to recognize that they also contribute to different levels of stress in different ways for different individuals, for different operations. So first, ag is seeing exciting opportunities coming from technology, but this doesn't come without its own set of stressors. So who pays for the tech? How to best use the tech? Who owns the tech? What happens when the tech breaks down? Beyond this, farmers are faced with evolving regulation. And as we all know, with regulation comes a growing amount of paperwork. And paperwork sometimes just having to prove that they're already outstanding measures of stewardship. So we all know what the trade barriers are doing to different farm operations, creating a lot of uncertainty, creating a lot of fear for the future. And we also know that with respect to kind of more technology, more changes in the markets, desire for a more transparent food system, we are getting more sophisticated supply chains, and just the general nature of sophistication, complication, changes in the markets, that just generates another sense of uncertainty all across the supply chain. So what I've loved and what I've enjoyed watching is that AgNo is situated and is constantly pulling in, and with the tentacles out there, just really understanding how these different things are affecting different groups and what are the results of this activity in terms of their ability to cope and whatnot, and we need to help them. So what's nice that we've seen is that Agno has a lot of regional supporters. Some of you are on the line today. And here's just two of the many statements that they've received from Alberta regional supporters, really validating the need for formal focus on trust, on the work that Agno is doing to not only garner information, but share the knowledge. And also through that sharing of the knowledge and collaborating and pulling different groups together, generating a system that allows folks to be swift and responsive to a lot of these stressors. So it's nice to see that formalization. Linda talked about storming, but now you're actually forming. So these two comments here come from District of Peace in the Wheatland County, and there are others. But I just wanted to, I think some of you are on the call today, and I just wanted to thank you for your